Hello, my name's Alex, and I'm going to talk to you today about history's best ever death. That is, if my asthma lets me. I'm a little bit worried at the moment, so let's keep our fingers crossed. I'm going to start here with a nice quotation from Umberto Eco, who claims that history has been hijacked. I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to leave it up there, and I'm going to ask you to just think about it, and we may come back to this idea a little bit later on. But first, I'm going to tell you a story. And this story takes place in 1180 in Jerusalem, in the last dying days of the Crusader Catholic Empire before Saladin reconquered the Holy Lands. It's not a story about anybody you've heard of. It's not a story about great men and what they do. This story features a young French girl who was suffering a terrible illness. Her skin was filled with lesions, she was losing her hair, there were boils all over her body. She was suffering from what today we might refer to as psychosis. Well, her family, loving her, like any loving family would, called for a doctor. Unfortunately, there was no European doctor available, so they had to get the next best thing for them, which was a local doctor, an Arabic doctor, a Muslim doctor. He came in, he surveyed his patient, and he immediately diagnosed the problem. She's suffering from a terrible nutritional deficiency. He said, look, you've got to open the window and let some fresh air in. You've got to change these sheets. You've got to hydrate her. And here's a regimen of fresh fruit and vegetables that you should give her, and in a few weeks' time, she's going to be okay. Well, of course, this was entirely the wrong sort of diagnosis for a Catholic family living in Jerusalem in 1180. So they kicked this guy out and went and got themselves a proper doctor, a French doctor. And he came in, surveyed the patient, and immediately diagnosed the problem. She's possessed by a demon. So what he did was immediately treat her. This involved shaving her head. He then used a scalpel to carve a cruciform into her scalp. He then pulled open the skin and poured in salt. And she died. I'm sure, though, her family were relieved that the demon was cast back to hell. And the thing about this story, the thing that it makes me think about as a historian, and maybe it'll make you think about, is, what is it about our world today, about the opinions I have today, about the values I have, that in 100 years or 1,000 years will be laughable or downright dangerous? Hey, have a think about that. We're going to come back to it later. Because first, I'd like to tell you a story. The story takes place in 1180 in Jerusalem, last dying days of the Crusader Empire before Saladin reconquered the Holy Lands, and it features a guerrilla war campaign against the Christians. This was a jihadist campaign. But it wasn't to kill people, and it wasn't to take machinery or technology or supplies. This was purely symbolic. So what this raiding party would do is gallop up to like an isolated church on the fringes of a village or so. And this was usually a one-story wooden building with a giant kind of 2-meter wooden cross adorned on top of it. What they do is they pull down the crucifix and then they would, defile it. And this took the following form. It would be urinated on, it would be defecated on, another bodily fluid would be emitted upon it, and then it would be thrown at the Christians that for some reason had gathered around to watch this strange, perverse form of performance art. And the thing that occurred to me when I heard this story for the first time was, imagine how awful it would be to be the fourth person in that jihadist raiding party. Because the first person is urinating on it, the second person is defecating on it, the third person after that is emitting another bodily fluid, and then the fourth person is to pick it up and throw it. And anybody that's ever thrown a wet sponge will tell you there's going to be a little bit of splashback. And it made me think, how on earth do we make sense of this? And the only way I can come up with is, this is the best definition of zealotry. This is fanaticism in a nutshell. And if we link that to our earlier story, it provides us with an awfully complex problem. How on earth can we reconcile a culture that at the same time can have such fanaticism and such calm, rational, scientific approach? It's almost like societies don't have one culture. Don't tell anybody. Think about that. We're going to come back to it a little bit later, because first, I'd like to tell you a story. This story takes place in 1180 in Jerusalem, in the last kind of dying days of the Crusader Empire, a few years before Saladin reclaimed the Holy Lands. And it features an individual. This time we've finally got to an individual called Louis. Louis was the son of a Frenchman, and the son also of a local Arabic woman. So he was in many ways a child of two cultures, but of course a citizen of neither. As a result, he grew up being an outsider, and he was treated as an outsider. He was kind of shamed and embarrassed, he was pulled from pillar to post, never fitting in. And lo and behold, he grew up to be a slightly dysfunctional individual. In fact, he became arguably the most hated man in 1180. And it is he who suffers history's best ever death, with the possible exception of Rasputin. But I don't think Rasputin's dead, I think he's still alive, living on the moon somewhere. So it brings us back to Louis. Well, what was this death that I'm telling you about? Well, he grew up to be a proper charlatan. He would sell religious relics to different kind of groups. So he'd go over to the sort of local kind of Arabic communities and he'd sell them a fake relic, and he'd go to sort of local Jewish communities, sell them a fake relic, and the local kind of Christian communities, sell them a fake relic. Anyway, his death was this. He was being chased by an angry mob to whom he had sold some fake relics, when he had an epileptic fit that was exacerbated by his extreme alcoholism. So far, I grant you, not too many laughs. But this is where it gets good. He fell down and banged his head on a pile of horse manure, which knocked him unconscious. And then, and I swear this is true, a pig climbed the pile of manure and sat on his face until he suffocated. And the only way I could think of a more humiliating death for anybody is if somehow he'd managed to come to with the pig on his face and he'd clawed his way off and got himself free, and he stood up and his face is red and he's sweating through his clothes, he's panting heavily, and everybody who's gathered around is laughing at him, and he just loses it. And he starts yelling, yeah, laugh it up! You all thought it was really funny when that pig was on my face! But it will take more than a pig sitting on my face to kill me! And at that exact moment, a flying soiled 2-meter wooden cross tears through the air and takes his head clean off his shoulders. And in the background, someone says, "That's a really good shot, Ibrahim, but I'm not going to give you a high five." And when we put this together, what does it tell us? Maybe it tells us that individuals can only be understood in the past, and maybe even today, if you contextualize them within the wider society and cultural framework. But be careful of reducing that society or that culture to just one thing. If you do that, it's lazy and it's dangerous. Well, I'm not the only person to have said this. Here's a quote from Theodor Adorno, the German philosopher, up there in German. And I'm going to impress you now. Oh, no it isn't. Okay. Oh, no. There you go. This is a quote from Theodor Adorno, and it's in German this time. And what he's saying here is, to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. Now, he doesn't mean this literally. I don't believe that his wife left him for a poet, or that he spent 20 years living in a prison, being forced to listen to slam poetry 24 hours a day, though if he had, it would be fair enough. No, instead, what Adorno is talking about here is that we have a duty. I as a teacher, my students as students, and everybody else as invested citizens, we have a duty not to reduce the past to simply the story of great men, not to simplify it. We have a duty to stare at the burning remnants of our history and compel ourselves to understand it with humility and with empathy. Or at least it will be if we get it right. Because history's been hijacked. And let me explain how. It's been hijacked by this idea that it's the story of great men and what they do. And that means great, rich, white, heterosexual men and what they do. And there's a problem here, I would put it to you. And the best way to explain this is through an example. So, the historian Neil Ferguson recently wrote a book called Titans of History. And in his book, it is 4,000 years of human civilization reduced to 175 5-page biographies of great leaders. So that's all of human experience in 175 people, which is about the number you could fit in this room. And that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is, of those 175, 15 are women. That's 8.5%. So thanks for your contribution, ladies. Neil Ferguson doesn't think you're up to much. Now, you might just say, look, that's just one book, it's just one dude, doesn't count. Give me another example. All right, let's take the International Baccalaureate and its IB History exam and the paper 2. This is the Global History paper. There's 30 questions on it. You have to answer 2, and they're divided into 5 topics. And those topics are peacemaking and peacekeeping, problems of democracy, single-party states, post-colonialism, and the Cold War. So you're probably thinking, sounds pretty good, sounds pretty broad, that's the kind of history you're talking about. Yeah, 30 questions, of which 2 are about the experience of women in history, which is the same number as ask you to write about Stalin. So that's Stalin and all women who have ever lived. And I would put it to you that that's a problem. Let's bring up George Orwell, because you got a little sneak preview spoiler alert earlier, so we might as well bring him up. This is what Orwell has to say about history when it's taken from you. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. Much is at stake about this. Much is at stake. So really, I'm here to make a very simple thesis today. I'm here to say, let's vow to make human history about human endeavour, to make human history about human fallibility. Yeah, let's do that. Let's look at people. Let's do that. Let's try to look at as many people as we can. And also, let's make history about complexity. Let's make it about culture. Let's make it about identity. Let's make it about meaning. Let's not make it the history of great men and what they do. That's biography, and it's bad biography at that. I suppose what I really mean, and this is the bit that you could tweet if you were... Let's not add our voices to the obnoxious choir advocating great men. Instead, all of us today, let's make a vow that we'll use history instead to speak for those who do not have a voice. Thank you very much.